Hello, I'm Marco Caracciolo of the Freiburg Institute for Advanced Studies in Germany, and I'll present a talk entitled Climate Futures, Narrative Experiments. I'm looking forward to your comments and reactions. I'll start by reading a passage from The Age of Wire and String, the first book published by American writer Ben Marcus. It is a glossary-like definition of what the narrator calls human weather. Human weather. Air and atmosphere generated from the speech and perspiration of systems and figures within the society. Unlike animal storms, it cannot be predicted, controlled, or even remotely harnessed. Cities, towns, and other settlements fold daily under the menace of this home-built air. The only feasible solution, outside of large-scale stifling or combustion of physical forms, is to pursue the system of rotational silence proposed by Thomson, a member of ideal physical deportment, his tongue removed, his skin muffled with glues, his eyes shielded under with pictures of the final scenery. The Age of Wire and String is not, ostensibly, about climate change or the aftermath of an ecological catastrophe. It is not even a narrative in the standard sense of the term. It is an encyclopedic description of a society, possibly our own society, seen through a grotesque, distortion-inducing lens. In this world, things take control over human actions, and the dividing line between animate and inanimate entities, humans and the weather, is constantly blurred. Clearly, the passage that I just read speaks to an era haunted by the specter of climate change. An era in which cities, towns, and other settlements may indeed fall daily due to anthropic interventions that may be described as human weather. Yet Marcus does much more than prefigure a possible climate future. He builds a weather-like unpredictability into the very logic of the language he uses. The result is profoundly different from the realism of climate change novels such as Ian McEwan's Solar or Barbara Kingsolver's Flight Behavior. This is experimental, weird fiction. Yet because of its weirdness, Marcus's novel is in a much better position, I would argue, than realist climate change fiction to come to grips with what Timothy Morton calls the strangeness of the mesh. As I'm sure you're aware, the mesh is Morton's metaphor for humans' entanglement with non-human realities such as the geological history of our planet or the evolution of life on Earth. Not only does the ecological crisis make us aware of this entanglement, but when seen in a certain light, it highlights the strangeness of the mesh. This is one of the key passages in Morton's ecological thought. Our encounter with other beings becomes profound. They are strange, even intrinsically strange. Getting to know them makes them stranger. When we talk about life forms, we're talking about strange strangers. The ecological thought imagines a multitude of entangled, strange strangers. In this talk, I'm interested in the lessons that theorists of narrative may draw from the weirdness of texts such as Marcus's. How can a text convey the realities of climate change, and particularly the strange unpredictability of its effects, while remaining, for all intents and purposes, a narrative? To put the same question otherwise, how can stories, and especially fictional stories, teach us to live with the radical uncertainty of what Marcus calls human weather? The problem sounds easier than it actually is. There have been repeated calls for artists to, quote, explore the implications of new narratives that are calibrated to the realities of our changing world. But these narratives have tended to engage with environmental changes at the level of plot and subject matter. They may thematize the realities of climate change, but they have not been able to convey the instability and radical uncertainty of the mesh in the same way as Marcus's non-narrative experimental text does. I claim that to be able to imagine the world in 2050, scholars and writers should pay more attention to the narrative strategies that may relay to readers our complex reliance on the non-human world. The uncertainty of our climate futures is a direct expression of the strangeness of the mesh. In keeping with this panel's general outlook, I will approach this issue in a speculative vein. This means that I'm interested in possible narrative ways of rendering the mesh. While I will refer to a number of literary novels and short stories composed roughly over the last half a century, not all of them are directly concerned with the ecological crisis. Yet I argue that we should draw inspiration from their innovative solutions as we imagine and narrativize the world in 2050. I will focus on 5 strategies and briefly examine them in the second part of this talk. I call them post-human gapping, multiple outcomes, biocatalog, object-oriented plotting, and non-human psychology. What these strategies have in common is that they put pressure on the fundamental dimensions of narrativity, respectively temporality, teleology, particularity, causality, and characterization. But while Ben Marcus's The Age of War and String oversteps the boundaries of narrativity, it is not a narrative text anymore. These are still, to a large extent, narrative strategies. Let me discuss them one by one. In post-human gapping, the narrative viewpoint is located in a post-human future, from which our own species is assessed. 2 examples are Kurt Vonnegut's novel Galapagos and Michel Houellebecq's The Elementary Particles. In the former, a deadly virus condemns all but a handful of humans to extinction. The narrator is a disembodied character who observes 1,000,000 years into the future the evolutionary fate of these survivors, namely how they evolved into seal-like creatures incapable of sophisticated language and lacking a recognizable culture. In the latter novel, readers find out towards the end of the text that the narrator belongs to an immortal and asexual species made possible by the protagonist's scientific discoveries. In both novels, the act of narration occurs across a temporal and epistemic gap, which enables Vonnegut and Houellebecq to include a post-human vantage point and thus overcome narrative's bias for the temporality of human life and human societies. Traditionally, narrative points toward a certain ending from which its ethical and emotional stakes are assessed. Post-human narration in Vonnegut and Houellebecq begins to challenge this teleological orientation of narrative, what Peter Brooks calls its necessary retrospectivity. But some narrative texts are even more radical than Vonnegut and Houellebecq in subverting this retrospectivity. This is the case of multiple outcome narratives, such as John Fowlis's novel The French Lieutenant's Woman, or Markham Bradbury's short story Composition. Both texts juxtapose different endings in a way that leaves readers in an interpretive no man's land, where they struggle to make sense of this authorial choice and work out its broader implications for the narrative they have just read. When used to imagine the future of our planet, this anti-teleological strategy would be uniquely able to render the unpredictability of climate change as well as humanity's role in shaping it, and perhaps in avoiding its worst consequences. Biocatalog is another strategy that can be used to convey the strangeness of humans' interdependency with the non-human world. It usually consists of a list or enumeration of natural things and processes. The focus here is on species, not on individuals, which undermines the particularity of narrative, its bias for specific characters and situations. For instance, A.S. Byatt's rewriting of Norse mythology Ragnarok contains a number of biocatalogs, listing and describing a wide gamut of living creatures. The progression of the narrative is interrupted by linguistic material that is apparently non-narrative in that it extends far beyond what any given plot could encompass. As many commentators have noted, Bayat's strategy serves as a poignant reminder of how human interventions in the ecosystem are putting biodiversity at risk. In what I call object-oriented plotting, the non-human is not contrasted with narrative, as in the biocatalog, but injected into the logic of the narrative itself. The plot is uncoupled, at least partially, from the psychological causality that normally drives its progression. The narrative tracks not a character's desires, but the vagaries of a material object. In this way, the text focuses on the physical world so as to foreground its multiple entanglements with human history and agency. A case in point is Don DeLillo's novel And the World. Here the plot follows a baseball, as it is handed down from character to character over half a century of US history during and after the Cold War. One of these characters points out that the baseball is the same size as the core of an atomic bomb. Another compares it to the waste left behind by past civilizations. Through this dense network of thematic associations, the baseball stands for humanity's enmeshment with material realities beyond the human. The complexity of DeLillo's narrative method conveys the strangeness of this enmeshment. If object-oriented plotting replaces psychological causality as the engine of plot with the material causality of things, non-human psychology directly conflates these forms of causality at the level of characters' mental processes. Psychologists have shown that the dichotomy between inanimate objects and entities endowed with mind is extremely basic in developmental terms. Narratives that challenge this dichotomy reveal an unsettling non-human element where we would least expect to find it, namely in the workings of a recognizable human mind. Typically, this is achieved by way of what Benjamin Beebike and Gunther Martens call a paranarrative, a cluster of metaphors and similes that run through a narrative and deepen its significance. In some texts, a metaphorical paranarrative invites readers to conceptualize characters' mental processes on the basis of an analogy with physical phenomena. Meteorological metaphors for mind are used in this way in two contemporary novels, Ghost, written by David Mitchell, and Atmospheric Disturbances by Rivka Galchen. The latter, for instance, centers on a narrator suffering from Capgras syndrome, a psychiatric condition that causes him to see his wife as an imposter, a lookalike of his real wife. As the title itself suggests, the narrator's mental illness is repeatedly compared to meteorological phenomena in a paranarrative that enriches our understanding of mental illness, even as it undercuts categorical distinctions between the mental and the physical. Indeed, the analogy could work both ways, just as the weather provides metaphors to model human subjectivity. The disturbances of the human mind can help us understand the complexity of our position vis-à-vis the non-human world. The call for papers for this conference invites participants, quote, to experiment with perspectives on the multiple possible states of the world in mid-century. With this talk, I wanted to begin thinking about how literary narrative itself can become a laboratory for such experiments with the future. As argued by Morton and many others, there is something inherently weird and unsettling in humanity's ability to shape the climate. First, it questions cognitively entrenched assumptions about our separation from the inanimate world. And second, it asks us to rise above our evolutionary propensity toward human-scale phenomena, calling for ethical choices on a species and not on an individual level. Fiction of the realistic variety, and especially fiction with a clear-cut environmentalist agenda, tends to sideline the strange element of climate change. It involves the climate in thematic but not in stylistic or narrative terms, and this undercuts its effectiveness. These texts may call for action, but their message is rooted in an experience that focuses on human characters and situations, not on the non-human realities with which we are intertwined. This is why we need experimental texts, which put pressure on the structures of narrative in order to render the instability of our position vis-à-vis geological and physical phenomena. As a practice, narrative is grounded in and geared toward the human-scale world and anthropocentric mentality whose shortcomings are exposed by the environmental crisis. Yet literary narrative has developed strategies to overcome this bias, offering readers the chance to peer beyond the narrow confines of our everyday experience. The inventory of strategies I have outlined in this talk is not meant to be exhaustive, but I believe it is at least representative of how literary narrative may serve as a probe into the complexity of the world in 2050. Thank you for your attention.